So
Rolling. We're rolling.
rolling.
On camera. Get on camera. Okay.
Is it
Ready?
recording?
Action.
Is
Yes.
it? You sure?
Yes.
There's no red.
Much like Johnny Cash, I am the man in black. I have just escaped from purgatory. Found guilty this morning. The fact that I care about your religion. I've broken out. Here I am. All right. Well, since we did not have lecture today, we will go ahead. Recording. The countdown's going. We'll go ahead and have a strange virtual experience here with Dr. Lewis, History 2710, talking about the Roaring Twenties. Beep. One of the very interesting things about the Roaring Twenties, and your readings with Schweikert and Zen, most of you reflect upon this. The Roaring Twenties can have multiple symbols and have multiple meanings based upon which part of the story we focus on. And the reason why it's referred to as the Roaring Twenties broadly is that up until that point,
Actually, can't even see the PowerPoint.
oh, okay, that works.
Just stand right there.
That's good. Stand right there. Oh, yeah, and lecture.
Is this thing on?
While there were many people who were left out of the economy of the Roaring Twenties, up until that part of American history, Americans had never experienced such absolute dynamic economic growth. As we've already discussed, from 1919 to 1921, there was a global recession. This is a natural phenomenon after a major world war, because as you are transitioning your economy over from military production to consumer production, it takes a while to kick that in, and particularly to start creating consumer demand. At the same time, when you have veterans coming back and trying to find jobs in an economy where unemployment is high, the first couple years after any war are always very turbulent for any nation. Luckily for the Allies on this, with the Treaty of Versailles and the War Guilt Clause, to keep things propped up for a while, we fleeced the Germans, but that's for another day. What's important to understand in terms of the dynamics of growth with 1922 to 1929, still to this day when politicians talk about tax policy and they talk about cutting taxes, they talk about deregulation, what they're really doing is looking back on the 1920s and trying to figure out the magic formula of how all of this worked, and to see if there are historic parallels they can draw, or at least mythologies they can create to support their own policies. If we look at this period, gross national product, which is the way you evaluate the creation and distribution of wealth in a society, gross national product is going to be rising every single year on average by 5.5%. That is absolutely insane economic growth. Unemployment rates are going to get underneath 5%, and for most of the decade, stay pegged right around 2%. And real wages in terms of industrial workers, and what we're talking about here is the actual purchasing power of somebody's wages, is going to be going up by about 15% every year. What we're seeing here is an economy, we're under Republican leadership, the economy is deregulated, tax breaks are instituted, and people are encouraged highly to invest in the stock market. What's important when it comes down to this phenomenon is that the stock market, it creates a huge amount of growth. And this is an example of one of these things where if you remove the bonds on people up here through what Reagan's going to call trickle-down economics, that yes, they use that extra money to create jobs here in the United States, and eventually that wealth trickles down to the rest of society. The problem, though, is if you are financing that wealth by getting all Americans involved in the stock market. It also means if an investor gets nervous and pulls out of the stock market and it crashes, all Americans are going to be impacted. Essentially, Americans, much like Germans last week, are dancing on top of a volcano that could potentially explode at any time. Beep. Now, for once, let's tell a positive story about Henry Ford. A story similar to the narrative you've grown up with, but we'll throw a few twists on it. Henry Ford's most important contribution to the world, outside of the assembly line and mass manufacturing, so that, people could afford products because the products cost less. But he has this crazy idea that most of his contemporaries call him insane, particularly in management at General Motors, is he has this crazy idea that he should voluntarily increase the wages of his workers and treat them like human beings. And even though there's no government regulation telling him he has to, and there's no union telling him he has to, Henry Ford says, I favor 5 days work with 6 days pay. What Henry Ford is recognizing, that until the last couple of generations we accepted as common logic, is that if you treat people as human beings, treat them with respect, they'll respect you back and they'll work hard. Yes, you've bought a loyal worker and you've bought a loyal consumer. Because those Ford workers, with that extra day of pay, what are they spending it on? They're spending it on Ford cars. Now, when we talk here about cars and radios during the 1920s, cars and radios are transforming the American experience and giving birth to what we've already talked about in class, Dr. Lewis's version of the American dream. It is not about the Bill of Rights. It's not about democracy. It's about having a car and hitting the open road, and that sense of freedom and escape and connection to the world around you. Prior to the 1920s, if you were an industrial worker, you were trapped in an unregulated city full of misery, crime, filth, and you didn't feel connected to your nation. Now, if we start having cars, if we look at a couple of quotes here from the 1920s from a group of sociologists that visited the industrial town of Muncie, Indiana, to interview working class people about their automobile. These sociologists, this first quote, we don't have no fancy clothes when we have the car to pay for. The car is the only pleasure we have. The next quote, I'll go without food before I'll see us give up the car. That second quote actually reminds me a lot of my older brother, because even when both he and his wife were unemployed, and they had all sorts of things, the one thing they always did is they held on to the car. Because, my brother loves cars, and that's what makes him happy. And, they lived in utter poverty for a number of years, but there is never a time they didn't have a car. What we are also going to see is now that we have liberated the working class from the city, is we are going to redefine the idea of middle class. And really the idea of, in many ways still to this day, what on earth it means to be a human being. Traditionally, the way people defined if they were middle class had almost exclusively to do with the occupation you held and the neighborhood you lived in. What we're going to do during the 1920s is to redefine the middle class experience in the sort of cliche notion that you've probably heard before of keeping up with the Joneses. What it now means to be middle class is you portray an aura and image of success to the world around you. And you prove your superiority to your neighbor based on that you own cooler stuff and newer stuff. And what's starting to help to fuel this economy is that if you recreate a society based upon images and based upon advertising. Now, advertising is inherently fueled by the concept of making people feel insecure and saying we can fix that insecurity if you purchase this product. So what begins to occur in the 1920s is Americans buying a whole lot of things that they don't need, not out of some sense of personal satisfaction, but looking at what their neighbors own and saying, I want to own something better. What is going to help to fuel this? Two different factors. Number one, we'll talk about this man in quite a bit of detail in the next several weeks. A young man who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, a man by the name of Edward Bernays, who founds the first advertising agencies in the United States. The other thing that's going to fuel this is General Motors in 1926 starts a new phenomenon of introducing the annual line. Prior to this, if you bought an automobile in the United States, particularly if you have bought a Ford car, Ford used to say that he had a great variety and selection, that you could buy his car in a black version, or a black version. Because he said Americans don't care about consumer variety, they don't care about fancy things. What they want is a cheap, dependable car that they can fix, and yeah, it's a good investment. And when General Motors introduces the annual line in 1926, Henry Ford says that's the most ludicrous concept ever. And Ford is completely wrong. Through mass marketing, what General Motors starts doing is that, yeah, if you own a 1925 car, GM car, that's still in perfect working condition, but your neighbor buys the 1926 GM model, you're also going to try and buy the 1926 model, only with fancier options. Or perhaps you'll wait until 1927 when your neighbor is still paying on that 1926 car. You trade in your 1925 car, which still runs fantastic, and you buy the 1927 car to make yourself look better. And what this breeds, yeah, if you have a person pitting themselves against other people in terms of status based upon how much junk they own that they don't need, yeah, it makes the economy boom. The other phenomenon is if you start trading those cars in. Working class people can't afford new cars. They can only afford used cars. And the more the middle class tries to compete with each other, the more this trickles down in consumer products. And welcome to the birth of consumer society. And also a fierce international competition between Ford and between General Motors. Beep. Now let's talk about the most notorious and perhaps most successful business leader in American history. A man by the name of Al Capone. What Al Capone is going to do in the city of Chicago is to find some loopholes in federal law and to identify that if a product has great consumer demand, and there are laws against that product prohibiting it, that a man can become a millionaire in that scenario if they play their cards right. Now, to put the policy of prohibition into context, what we're going to see in January of 1920, and once again your readings talk about this phenomenon, is the 18th Amendment being passed to the Constitution of the United States, making alcohol sales throughout the country illegal. What many urban reformers had argued was that things such as the 18th Amendment would help to lift up the condition of poor people, particularly in major cities, through the argument of saying that booze made people immoral, and that when people had access to booze, they spent all of their extra paycheck down at the bar instead of saving it, investing in the future, and that, yeah, if you wanted to improve the condition of urban working class, you first get alcohol out of it. The problem with this, much like the reason why we have seen our neighboring state of Colorado legalize marijuana, is that if you enforce prohibition upon a product that was already legal and that is still quite popular, you are not going to get rid of that product. You are certainly not going to get rid of crime. What's occurring here is we are taking an industry that was already quite popular and kind of self-regulated and handing it over to organized crime. Because Al Capone has recognized in the city of Chicago that there are only 1,500 federal agents in the entire nation to enforce this policy, which is not even enough to enforce this policy in Brooklyn, let alone the entire nation. So that is only 1,500 federal agents that if you have a monopoly on the industry, that's 1,500 people to buy off or to intimidate or get them to look the other way, particularly since Chicago is right there on Lake Michigan. The Canadians are still brewing beer and whiskey, eh? And you just fill up a ship, you bring it down to Chicago or other places in northern Michigan, and If you try and compete with Al Capone, his solution for competition is not advertising, it's the Tommy gun. Al Capone shoots his competition. So in this sort of struggle to attempt to bring an end to urban violence and crime, what people involved in Prohibition did was they helped to increase urban violence and crime, which is the same reason why someplace like Colorado has now legalized marijuana, is that if you take it away from the criminal element and you regulate it, crime goes down. And if you tax it, well, you have a consistent source of tax revenue coming in for all sorts of things because, yeah, people in Colorado enjoy getting stoned. Just like many other people enjoy beer and other alcoholic products. What is going to intensify a cultural reaction against this is Sigmund Freud. We talked about Freud in previous lectures, discussed some of his ideas in our lecture about the unholy trinity of Darwin, Freud, and Nietzsche. Now, where does Sigmund Freud become a common name? Sigmund Freud did most of his important writings prior to World War I, and at the end of the war became a popular, prominent figure throughout the world. Because people are utilizing Sigmund Freud and his ideas about sex, sexuality, and mental health to justify brand new lifestyles and behaviors. Just as ideas of Darwin were switched around to create social Darwinism, which legitimized things such as racism, genocide, all these things that Darwin didn't talk about, is people could use Freud's ideas to legitimize premarital sex and multiple partners. Now, let's break this down. Freud said that the reason why people are crazy and neurotic is that coming out of Victorian society, which repressed every single aspect about sexuality, that people didn't understand their own bodies, they didn't understand their partner's bodies, and for the fact that nobody would talk about it, everyone was going insane. And he said, number one, if we talk about it, number two, if we analyze it, number three, if we accept that sex is not a sin, but sex is a good part and healthy part of the human existence, then people won't be so crazy. The problem with this is that, Freud never said go have multiple sexual partners, go have premarital sex. But people want to engage in these things. Say, Dr. Freud says that sex is good, sex is healthy, so I'm going out to the club tonight, and I'm going to hook up with somebody. What we are going to see in many of the jazz clubs, particularly in places like New York City, is even though alcohol is illegal, booze is still flowing in these jazz clubs. Who are the musicians? They're primarily African Americans. And who are the consumers and clientele? They're primarily young, middle-class women who have just gotten the right to vote with the 19th Amendment and who are choosing alternative lifestyles and options in their 20s. People that we refer to as the flappers. What the flappers are, it's a sexual revolution that goes on with young women in the early 1920s where they say, I had my own job during the war, I didn't need a man. I now have the right to vote, so I don't need a man to decide my politics. And now that we have this new youth culture, it's not women rejecting motherhood or family. It's women saying, there's alternatives. And that I can choose one lifestyle in my 20s with, say, as many people at university say, sow your wild oats and experience life, and then later choose motherhood. What we are going to see here, though, is a drastic split now happening in the United States between an urban culture that is largely about young people, booze, and sex. Particularly, there's this strange notion during the 1920s that young women rejecting the idea of the missionary position, and that now young women are the ones who choose the partners, and when they take them home with them, young women being on top, which takes everything about society and norms prior to this, turns it all topsy-turvy, and creates a huge split in America. And if you live in a city during In the 1920s, you live in one world. If you come from a small community, you live in a different world. And if you're a member of a small community who meets people from the city or goes to visit people in the city, you don't recognize your own nation. Beep. So how do we explain this complex phenomenon? Scapegoating. Thank you, Ku Klux Klan. 1915, the Ku Klux Klan, which had been abolished as a terrorist organization back in 1871, reemerged in the state of Texas. This time not under the old slogan of the South shall rise again and restoring the Confederacy, but under a new principle and guiding motivation that the KKK was out to protect white Christian civilization from outside threats. Particularly the argument that young people were being corrupted and destroyed by an international conspiracy of Catholics, Jews, and African Americans. And if you want to try and recruit people to the KKK, during the 1920s, the literature you distribute, and it's your selling point at any time, is Henry Ford's book, The International Jew. And when you talk with people about politics, if they initially reject you, you say, have you read Mr. Ford's book? You go, Henry Ford, the car guy, he wrote a book? Like, yeah, here's a complimentary copy. And we're having a meeting in a few nights. You should come join us. The way you legitimize this is, number one, through the writings of somebody like Henry Ford, and number two, yes, as we've talked about in some of our other lectures, when it comes to scapegoating, cherry picking information and saying the rest has been covered up by a conspiracy. Because Al Capone, what's his religious background? He's Catholic. That's the Catholics getting kids drunk. Sigmund Freud, what's his background? He's Jewish. And who are the people playing in those jazz clubs and getting people drunk or going out and having premarital sex? Well, those are African Americans in places like Harlem. And if you want to try to interpret a very complex transitional world around you through very, very simple ideas, as you say, there's an international conspiracy of Catholics, Jews, and blacks to destroy white Christians. Beep. What is going to intensify the sense of religious alienation, particularly in small communities, has nothing to do with theology, it has to do with economics. And once again, even though economics is the aspect of the world around us that defines pretty much everything about our daily experiences, for the fact that human beings have a very difficult time understanding the complexity of economics, we very rarely talk about it. Now let's talk about the economic plight of the American farmer, who traditionally throughout U.S. history and in current times as well is the most neglected and ignored sector of American society. Because even though it's the American farmer that, grows the food that keeps us alive, for the fact that farmers come from small communities and small communities have small populations and therefore less people involved in politics and voting, is that, politicians always focus on major cities, and it's very rare that they pay any attention to small communities. Which means when it comes down to economic problems, it is always American farmers that suffer first, they suffer the worst, and the ones who are the longest ignored, because they're not a huge voting bloc. What is going to occur during World War I is much the same thing we visited several weeks ago with the Crimean War. While Europeans are off fighting a war against each other, particularly as Ukrainians are off fighting for Imperial Russia. As American farmers decide to step in to the international market again. For the fact that the Ukraine is still to this day called the breadbasket of Europe, and it's where most European grain comes from. While those Ukrainian farmers are off fighting for the Tsar, American farmers say, we'll expand out our farms and we'll sell grain internationally. The problem with this, if we compare technology and acres of land. In 1914 compared to 1922, the number of tractors being utilized by farmers has quadrupled, and we have cleared 35 million new acres of farmland. And most of this farmland is being used for grain production, which while World War I is going on, you have no competition. So if you're a farmer, you're taking a gamble, and that gamble's paying off. The problem with that gamble is that, you bought your tractor on credit. And you cleared that land, probably by borrowing money. And when the Russian Civil War comes to an end in 1923, and those farmers who have been away from tending their farms for about 10 years, and those farmers go back to farming in the Ukraine, it increases the supply of a commodity, which immediately takes the price and plummets it. And if you've bought a tractor in the last few years during this gamble, we don't have debtor's prison anymore. You're going to lose everything. If we look broadly at the 1920s, during this time we're going to see over 3 million American farmers going bankrupt and losing everything. The problem is for those farmers who hold on, if you compare their annual wages and purchasing power with the average industrial worker in the city, a farmer is only pulling in about 25% of that wage. And yeah, if you're a farmer, it's not like working at a factory where you show up for a 10-hour shift and then you go home. If you're a farmer, you start before the sun comes up, you end far after the sun goes down, and you're being left out of this prosperity. And you're resentful. And when you go to those cities, if you actually get a chance to go to those cities, you see a bunch of young people who are being adulterous, getting drunk, and having the time of their lives, and you say, there's something that's gone wrong. And perhaps what's gone wrong is that God is no longer the center of our lives. One of the things we need to understand about religious trends, typically religious recruiting, particularly in small communities, almost always coincides with economic downturns. Because if for no other reason, if you're feeling insecure, if you don't have Xanax, the gospel can be a great Xanax, and it's free. And it gives people faith, it gives them hope, it gives them security, it gives them reason to get up in the morning. And particularly if you feel that the source of your faith is under attack. Welcome to the Scopes Monkey trial of 1925. What we have occurring here is a final, I would say, a rift in America that still has not even slightly been healed. If you come from a small town or small community, it's a community where everyone knows each other, there's very little crime, and typically you all are of the same faith. Or if you are of different faiths, you respect each other's faiths. And the center of your life is the church. And if you come from a large city, people in big cities that claim that they represent the real America. Because they're individuals, they're anonymous, they're innovative, they're creative, and they are not guided by principles. They're not guided by traditional principles, people in small communities would say. Where this phenomenon comes from is good old Darwin and his theory of evolution. What occurred in the year 1924 was the state of Kansas fired a young science teacher by the name of John Scopes because he taught Darwin's theory of evolution in the classroom. And in Kansas, if you were a science teacher in the public school system, legally, you were only allowed to teach the theory of creationism. What John Scopes argued quite effectively, and he got the ACLU to support this, is he said, regardless if it's creationism versus evolution, he said creationism is something based upon, it's based upon the book of Genesis, which is a theological document, not a scientific document. He says Darwin is based on evidence and science and verifiable evidence, and even if you don't agree with its conclusions, if you were going to teach a science class, you cannot ban a scientific theory and replace it with a theological creed. What's going to occur here is the ACLU assists John Scopes in suing the state of Kansas to try and get his job back. The problem for the state of Kansas is they have brought on a lawyer by the name of William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan at this